Okay, so chapter 14, the autonomic nervous system. This is kind of a short one, but it does have some important information in it, so let's get started. So the autonomic nervous system has motor neurons that are going to innervate smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, as well as glands. And they operate through subconscious control. So we saw before, looking at motor neurons in the somatic nervous system, controlling skeletal muscles. You see here we have two divisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So let's make some comparisons. In the somatic nervous system, the effectors were skeletal muscles. In the autonomic nervous system, the effectors, as I said, are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. As far as pathways in the somatic nervous system, we have myelinated somatic motor fibers that make up the pathway from the central nervous system to the muscle. And then in the autonomic nervous system, here's a key difference. It's a two-neuron chain. We have a preganglionic neuron, and it's lightly myelinated, or has a lightly myelinated preganglionic axon. And then we have a ganglionic neuron, which has an unmyelinated postganglionic axon. So we talked a little bit about preganglionic and postganglionic neurons here. Well, here we have this two-neuron chain we'll be talking about more in this chapter. As far as neurotransmitter comparison, in the somatic nervous system, we saw that acetylcholine was the neurotransmitter we used, and it is always stimulatory at the skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system, we have some differences here, and we're going to look at this, and I'm going to show it to you on a picture as well. But the preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine. The postganglionic fibers can release norepinephrine or acetylcholine, and the effects can be either stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the receptor type. So let's look at a little more detail on the next slide. If you look here, it shows the somatic nervous system, which we already are familiar with, right? Releasing acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter and the effector being the skeletal muscle and the effect being stimulatory. Now, when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, we have both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, okay? And when we look at that, the parasympathetic, if we look at we have a preganglionic axon and we have a postganglionic axon for each of those except for the bottom of the sympathetic, which I'll talk about in a moment. But if you look, let's start with sympathetic first. We've got a preganglionic axon of the sympathetic, and that releases acetylcholine. You can see that in the picture. You look at the parasympathetic. The preganglionic of the parasympathetic also releases acetylcholine, okay? And then we have the postganglionic of the parasympathetic releasing acetylcholine. The only one that's releasing something different out of these four is going to be the postganglionic of the sympathetic nervous system. That releases norepinephrine. So the NE there is norepinephrine. Okay? And so it's easy to remember the one that's different, right? So we say that the sympathetic postganglionic axon releases norepinephrine. The other three release acetylcholine. Even when we have just one a preganglionic axon in the sympathetic nervous system going directly to the adrenal medulla, it's still releasing acetylcholine. Okay, so we can remember which ones release which neurotransmitter, and then of course you can see the target effector organs. And then again, we said it could be stimulatory or inhibitory. That is dependent on the receptor type. Now, we know that we have the two parts of the autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, and they serve almost all visceral organs. And you're going to see that they have opposite effects in almost all cases. So when we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, what are some of the activities that it causes? Well, a couple of little memory cues to remember are feed and breed, rest and digest, because those activities are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. Also the D activities, digestion, defecation, diuresis, and diuresis being the formation of urine. Some other things that are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system: at rest, blood pressure; at rest, your heart rate; and at rest, your respiratory rates are controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. Your GI tract activity is controlled by the parasympathetic, so that's the digest portion there, right? Pupils are constricted, and lenses are accommodated for close vision when the parasympathetic nervous system is active. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is known as your fight or flight. So exercise, threat, things like that can stimulate it. The E activities: exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment. These are some examples of things that activate the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system will always shut off the parasympathetic nervous system, so it will always override it. So if we activate the sympathetic nervous system, it takes over a number of functions, right? So it's going to cause vasoconstriction systemically. That means body-wide, and that means the blood vessels get smaller, and that's going to raise the blood pressure. So now we're in charge of the blood pressure as a sympathetic nervous system. It's going to dilate the bronchioles, it's going to open them up, right? Those are the tubes in the lungs. It's going to send more blood to skeletal muscles and heart. It's going to put sugar into, or glucose into the blood from the liver. And so all of these things are things that would happen. Now, here's an easy way to remember this in one sense. When you exercise, it activates sympathetic nervous system. So what happens? Respiratory rate goes up, right? Your heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. We're releasing sugar because we need it for energy, right, into the blood. We are sending more blood to the skeletal muscles and heart, right? So it's a fight or flight response. Right? So that's where we're doing all of these types of activities with the sympathetic nervous system. Now, when we're looking at the divisions of the sympathetic nervous system, the origins of the sympathetic nervous system come from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. The parasympathetic come from the brain and the sacral region of the spinal cord. And if we look at the length of the fibers, we can see, and you can see it on the next picture, the preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system are short, and the postganglionic are long. For the parasympathetic, the preganglionic are long and the postganglionic are short. All right, this just shows a little illustration of, if you look at what I drew on the lungs there, you can see the preganglionic fiber is short, right, and the postganglionic fiber is long. And if you look at the one up the top at the eye, the preganglionic fiber is long and the postganglionic fiber is short. And so that's what I was illustrating or talking about on the previous slide. If we were to go back and look at that previous slide, you can see that a preganglionic fiber can do a couple of things. It can synapse with a ganglionic neuron within the same ganglion. It can ascend or descend the sympathetic trunk to synapse with another trunk ganglion. This is in the sympathetic trunk ganglion, by the way. Or it can pass through the trunk ganglion to emerge without synapsing. So on the next slide, I'll look at each of these three, and I'll do it in colors. I'll make number 1 blue, number 2 red, and number 3 green. And so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. All right, so this shows you 1, 2, and 3 from the previous slide. So blue, red, and green. You can go ahead and reference that on your slides. Now, we've talked about somatic reflex arcs. The visceral reflex arc is going to have the same components, but there's going to be one key difference. In a visceral reflex arc, it's going to have 2 neurons in the motor pathway. Let's go ahead and look at that. So on this slide, you can see it's almost identical to the somatic reflex arc. We've got a sensory receptor. We've got the sensory neuron, right, sending the afferent into the spinal cord. We have the integration center in the spinal cord. But then when we look at the efferent pathway, there's a preganglionic neuron and a ganglionic neuron, so 2-chain neuron. And then we have the effector. So the only difference here is that there's a 2-neuron chain in the efferent pathway. Now when we talk about referred pain, visceral pain afferents, the sensories, travel along the same pathways as somatic pain fibers. So the pain stimuli that arise in the viscera or the organs are going to be perceived sometimes as somatic in origin. For example, if you have a heart condition, you can get this referred pain to the left arm. So it's not actually somatic. It's not something going on in the left arm. It's referred from the heart. Okay, so when we talk about neurotransmitters, we're going to talk about some different types of fibers, and then we'll talk about some different types of receptors. Cholinergic fibers are going to release acetylcholine. So that's kind of easy to remember. Cholinergic, acetylcholine. And all of the preganglionic fibers, we said, release acetylcholine, and all parasympathetic postganglionic fibers release acetylcholine. Now, we also have adrenergic fibers, and those are going to release norepinephrine. Most sympathetic postganglionic axons release the norepinephrine. This goes back to that picture where I was showing you the 4, right? And so we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic, both pre- and postganglionic axons. Now, there's an exception in the adrenergic fibers. The sympathetic postganglionic fibers secrete acetylcholine at sweat glands and some blood vessels and skeletal muscles. That's an exception. But we're going to memorize the rule that most of them are sympathetic most sympathetic postganglionic fibers release norepinephrine. And this is just that picture we looked at before. So you can kind of review this picture and see which fibers are releasing acetylcholine, which are releasing norepinephrine. Now, when we talk about receptors, cholinergic receptors are for acetylcholine. So acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors. Adrenergic receptors bind norepinephrine. We have subcategories of cholinergic receptors. So the two types are nicotinic and muscarinic. These are both cholinergic receptors, which means they bind acetylcholine. Where do we see nicotinic receptors? Well, we see them on the motor end plates of skeletal muscle. We see them, so all ganglionic neurons, sympathetic and parasympathetic, have receptors on them for acetylcholine, which makes sense because all of the preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, right? Also, we see it on hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla. They're going to have receptors for acetylcholine as well. If we go back to the picture, we can see all of those. The effect of acetylcholine at nicotinic receptors is always stimulatory. Muscarinic receptors, so all the effector cells stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers are going to be these muscarinic type of receptors, okay? The effect of acetylcholine at muscarinic receptors can vary. So it can be either inhibitory or excitatory, and that is going to depend on the receptor type on that specific target cell. So in the cardiac muscle, and we mentioned this in a different chapter, but in the cardiac muscle, acetylcholine is going to be inhibitory, right? Because of the types of receptors there. In the GI tract, it's going to be excitatory, just like it's excitatory at the skeletal muscle. For adrenergic receptors, we have alpha and beta, and there are some subtypes. So alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to get into too much to the subtypes. I really won't talk about those. But the alpha adrenergic receptors are usually stimulatory, and the beta are usually inhibitory. There is a specific notable exception. When norepinephrine binds to beta receptors of the heart, it's stimulatory. Again, beta receptors are usually inhibitory. So at the heart, though, it's stimulatory. A couple of drugs to be familiar with. You have atropine, which is anticholinergic. What this does is it blocks muscarinic receptors. So what is it used for? To prevent salivation during surgery, to dilate the pupils for eye exams. Neostigmine is another drug, and that inhibits acetylcholinesterase. Remember, acetylcholinesterase breaks down acetylcholine. So if we don't break down acetylcholine, it causes more muscle activity. So this is used to treat myasthenia gravis. A number of over-the-counter drugs they're sold for allergy, nasal symptoms, colds, things like that. They stimulate alpha adrenergic receptors. Also, we have beta blockers. Beta blockers are drugs that attach to the beta 2 receptors. And what they do is they dilate the lung bronchioles without trying to stimulate the heart. Remember, at the heart, the beta receptors can be stimulatory. And so even though they're usually inhibitory, so what we want to do with a beta blocker is open up the bronchioles of the lungs without raising the heart rate. So this is used in asthma medications. So we'll go into the finish of this chapter talking about sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And we said they're antagonistic to each other. So sympathetic raises heart rate, respiratory rate, and blocks digestion. Parasympathetic increases digestion, lowers heart rate and respiratory rate. So you see these opposition or antagonism of functions. Now, the sympathetic nervous system will control your blood pressure, even at rest, through something called sympathetic tone or vasomotor tone. So it keeps the blood vessels in a continual state of partial constriction, so they're never just blown out and dilated. That's called sympathetic tone. So it's a specific function, specialized to the sympathetic nervous system. So what is parasympathetic tone? Well, it normally dominates the heart and smooth muscle of the digestive system and the urinary tract. It slows the heart rate. Again, this dictates normal activity of digestive and urinary tract, but the sympathetic nervous system can override it, right? We said that the sympathetic nervous system, if it becomes active, it always overrides it, which means it will inhibit digestion. It will raise the heart rate, because we know sympathetic is going to lower or slow the heart rate. Now, there are cooperative effects of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. They don't do the same thing, but they work in like one specific overall goal or function. So parasympathetic nervous system is going to be responsible for causing the erection of both the penis and clitoris, and then the sympathetic fibers are responsible for ejaculation in males and reflex contraction for the female vagina. And so they're working in tandem But the sympathetic, once it caused ejaculation, see, it does shut off the parasympathetic, which stimulated the erection. Okay, so you see in this case, they're working cooperatively. Now, there are unique roles to the sympathetic nervous system that it does not share with parasympathetic. And if we look at a couple of these things, so let's just read through them. The thermal regulatory responses to heat, release of renin from the kidneys. This is an enzyme that's going to stimulate this whole reaction. It's going to raise blood pressure. Some other metabolic effects, increasing metabolic rate, raising blood glucose levels, mobilizing fat as used for fuel. These are all things that you'll see that are specific, unique to the sympathetic nervous system. If we compare effects of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic is short-lived, and it's highly localized control over the effectors, so it's more local, and sympathetic is longer lasting and it's body-wide effects. So why does sympathetic nervous system activation last longer? It's because of norepinephrine. So it's inactivated more slowly than we inactivate acetylcholine, break it really down really quickly with that acetylcholinesterase. Norepinephrine and epinephrine get released into the blood. They remain there for a longer period of time until they can get broken down by the liver. So what controls autonomic nervous system activity? Well, the main integrative center for it is the hypothalamus. And we talked about the hypothalamus having all these widespread effects. We talked about it in the central nervous system chapter. But it does control the autonomic nervous system, or is the main integration center for the autonomic nervous system. So when we talk about hypothalamic control, we see it controls heart rate, it controls blood pressure, it controls your body temperature, water balance, endocrine activity, because it controls both the anterior and posterior pituitary, the anterior hormonally, the posterior neurologically. It also plays a role in emotional stages and biological drives, and reactions to fear and the fight or flight system.